The night of the 11th of November, 1940. A few minutes before 11 o'clock, the harbour of Taranto on the heel of Italy. The air is cold and very clear. The water in the anchorage lies flat and black, and along the shore the lights of the town are burning, because Italy is winning this war, and the men here have no particular reason to expect trouble tonight. A gunnery officer named Antonio Vaccari stands near the water and looks out at the most powerful fleet his country has ever assembled. 6 battleships. Cruisers and destroyers range beyond them. Vaccari has spent his adult life around naval guns. He knows the range tables by memory. He helped think through the defences of this harbour, and on paper those defences are among the best in the world. He hears the aircraft before he sees them, a low, ragged drone drifting in off the sea from the southwest. Then a searchlight swings, catches something and holds it, and Vaccari is looking at a thing his training tells him cannot be there. They are biplanes, open cockpits, fixed wheels hanging beneath fabric wings, struts, bracing wire, machines from the last war, not this one. They are coming in so low that their wheels seem to brush the surface of the sea, heading straight for the line of battleships, and slung beneath each one is a torpedo. Vaccari understands torpedoes. He understands the one rule every naval officer on Earth is taught. A torpedo dropped from an aircraft plunges deep before it levels out and runs, and the water beneath those battleships is barely 40 feet deep. He has done the arithmetic. The arithmetic says those torpedoes will dive straight into the mud of the harbour floor and achieve nothing at all. The arithmetic is sound. It is also, in about 4 minutes, going to be wrong. This is not a story about 21 outdated aeroplanes. This is a story about the night the most powerful weapon on Earth was quietly made obsolete, and how the men who owned that weapon were the very last to understand what they had just seen. Part 1. Before we watch those torpedoes reach the water, we owe Antonio Vaccari something. We owe him the truth that he was not a fool. He was right. His confidence was not arrogance. It was doctrine. It was the settled opinion of every serious navy on Earth, including the one that was about to break it. If you had done the same sum that night, standing on that shore with everything Vaccari knew, you would have reached the same answer he did. The Italian Navy of 1940, the Regia Marina, was not a backward force. It was modern, it was fast, and it was handled by professionals. Its newest battleships were among the finest afloat anywhere, and its strategy did not require it to go looking for a fight. It only required it to exist. This is the idea the historians call a fleet in being. You do not have to defeat your enemy at sea. You only have to keep a powerful fleet ready, in a safe harbour, so that your enemy must always account for it. He must always hold ships back to watch it. He must always move carefully because of it. A fleet that is never sunk is a fleet that is always winning, quietly, simply by being there. And for that strategy to work, you need one thing above everything else. You need a harbour the enemy cannot reach. Taranto was that harbour. Consider what waited there for any attacker. 101 anti-aircraft guns, 193 machine guns, searchlights and acoustic listening posts ringing the water, a screen of barrage balloons trailing steel cable up into the sky, to tear the wings off any aircraft foolish enough to come in low. And beneath the surface, lines of anti-torpedo netting hung around the battleships like curtains of chain, to stop the one weapon that could gut a capital ship from below. They had counted the guns, they had counted the balloons, they had counted the nets, they had counted everything a rational officer could count, and then, on top of all of it, they had the deepest defence of all, the one that cost them nothing, because it was simply a fact of nature. The water was too shallow. Every navy in the world agreed on the number. To drop a torpedo from an aircraft and have it work, you needed deep water beneath the target, something on the order of 75 feet, because that was how far the torpedo would plunge before it recovered and ran level. The anchorage at Taranto was barely 40 feet deep. Not close. Barely half of what the rule demanded. Pause on that sentence, because it is the hinge of the entire night. The Italians were not trusting to luck. They were trusting to arithmetic. And the arithmetic was sound. There is one more thing you should know, because it makes the story stranger, not simpler. The British had wanted to do this for years. The plan was not dreamed up in a week. Its outline went back to the Abyssinia crisis of 1935, and it had a patient, stubborn champion, a naval airman named Lumley Lister, who had been telling the Admiralty since 1938 that his obsolete biplanes could strike an enemy fleet at anchor, at night, and cripple it. For years that idea sat in a drawer. It sat there precisely because sensible men kept doing the same some Vaccari did and kept arriving at the same answer. Too shallow, too well defended, too mad. The Italian model of the world was not broken. It worked. It had always worked. It worked right up until the moment it didn't. Part 2. Now, the weapon itself. Because if the harbour was the perfect defence, the thing sent to break it was on paper almost a joke. The aircraft crossing the sea toward Taranto was a Fairey Swordfish. It was a biplane, designed in the early 1930s, in frontline service since 1936. It was built of metal tube and fabric. Its cockpit was open to the freezing air, its wheels were fixed and did not fold away. Its top speed, in level flight, was about 139 miles per hour, and loaded with a torpedo it flew a good deal slower than that. It was slower than some of the ships it was sent to sink. The men who flew it did not even give it a warrior's name. They called it the Stringbag, after the loose string shopping bags their mothers carried to market, because like those bags it could apparently be made to carry almost anything. Bombs, mines, flares, and a single torpedo, 18 inches across and weighing over 1,600 pounds, slung between its fixed wheels. It was not fast, it was not modern, it was not by any measure an Air Force would recognise a serious front-line machine, and it was about to sink more enemy tonnage than any other British aeroplane of the entire war. 21 of them were to make the attack, flying from the deck of the carrier Illustrious, launched into the dark from a position about 170 nautical miles from the target. Reconnaissance aircraft flying from Malta had confirmed days before that the whole Italian fleet was sitting in the harbour. The trap was set. The Swordfish went in 2 waves. The first wave was 12 aircraft, and it was led by a man named Kenneth Williamson, commanding 815 Squadron. To carry enough fuel for the long crossing over open sea, the crews had stripped out the rear gunner and fitted an extra fuel tank in his place. 2 men then, in each open cockpit, a pilot, and behind him an observer, navigating 170 miles across black water, at night, by hand, with a pencil and a chart and the stars. There is a kind of courage that gets remembered in medals, and there is a quieter kind that just does the sums correctly in the freezing dark so that the aeroplane arrives over the right harbour. The second kind flew that night too, in every rear cockpit, and almost none of those men are named anywhere. At about 22:58, the first Swordfish reached the outer anchorage. Some of them climbed and laid a line of flares along the far side of the harbour, so that the great battleship stood out as black shapes against the light, perfectly framed for the aircraft coming in low from the opposite side. And then Williamson took his section down. He took them down almost to the surface of the water, below the level of the ship's own guns, through the searchlights and the wall of anti-aircraft fire, and drove straight at the battleship Conte di Cavour. He released his torpedo. It ran, shallow and true, in the exact way the rulebook swore it could not. It struck Cavour below the waterline and tore a hole in her side the better part of 30 feet across, and then the guns caught Williamson's aircraft, and it went down into the harbour. He and his observer survived, pulled from the water, and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. His torpedo had already done its work. Think about what the Italian gunners were seeing. Not a massed formation of modern bombers. A handful of fabric biplanes, the sort of thing many of them had first learned to fly on, coming in one after another, impossibly slow, impossibly low, and putting torpedoes into the sides of the newest ships in the fleet. It was so far outside anything in their doctrine that some Italian officers, in those first minutes, reportedly could not work out what kind of aircraft was even attacking them. Let me say something here, because this is the right place to say it. Men like Williamson and his observer, who flew an open biplane into the most heavily defended harbour in Europe in the middle of the night, expecting not to come back, deserve to be remembered by more than a footnote. If this video has earned it, a like costs you nothing, and it keeps their story in front of a few more people who have never once heard it. That is the whole of the ask. It matters more than it should. Part 3. Here is the question that matters, and it is not the one people usually ask. The question is not how brave the pilots were. They were brave, and we will come back to that. The question is this: how did a torpedo run in 40 feet of water when the entire naval world agreed you needed nearly twice that? 40 feet. Hold on to that number, because it is the number the whole night turns on. 40 feet of water was supposed to be a wall. It was supposed to make Taranto untouchable. Instead, 40 feet of water became the exact place where the age of the battleship began to end. The answer was not courage. The answer was engineering. Quiet, unglamorous, British engineering of the kind that almost never makes it into the story at all. The problem was the plunge. A torpedo leaves the aircraft, hits the sea, and dives before it recovers and levels out. In 40 feet of water, it dives into the mud and stops. So the British changed the way it fell. They rigged a simple arrangement of wire running from a small drum on the aircraft to the nose of the torpedo. As the torpedo dropped away, the wire held its nose up so that instead of knifing in steeply, the weapon entered the water in a shallow belly flop and levelled off far higher than it had any right to. They set the torpedoes to run at a carefully chosen depth, calculated to slide underneath the very anti-torpedo nets the Italians were counting on, and they fitted a new firing pistol that could set the warhead off either on direct contact or by sensing the steel of a hull passing above it. None of that was the work of a famous inventor. It was the work of naval armourers and torpedo officers, men whose names are mostly lost, bent over these weapons on a carrier's hangar deck, solving a very specific problem with wire and patience and arithmetic. And that is the British military tradition at its most characteristic. Not the lone genius in a laboratory, the competent amateur, the practical expert, the man who quietly makes an impossible thing work and then does not talk about it very much afterward. Now, why could the Italians not simply copy it? There are two immediate reasons and one deep one. The immediate reasons are these. They could hear the aircraft, they could see them pinned in the searchlights, but they had no radar to track them in the dark and no night fighters to hunt them, and so all they could really do was throw fire up into the sky and hope. That is the surface answer. The deeper answer is harder, and it is the real subject of this film. The British could do this because for years, and against a great deal of resistance from their own admirals, they had invested in a single unfashionable idea. That aircraft could sink the biggest ships afloat. They had built carriers. They had built a naval air arm. They had kept alive a small, stubborn community of officers, Lister among them, who simply refused to let that idea die. Italy had a magnificent navy and a magnificent air force. What it did not have was the two of them joined together. Its aircraft and its ships were run by separate services, kept apart, and Italy did not possess a single aircraft carrier of its own. So even in the days after Taranto, when every Italian admiral understood exactly what had been done to them, they could not answer it in kind. They had no deck to fly from. You cannot copy, in a week, an idea your rivals spent 20 years building. That is why 40 feet of water mattered so much. It was never really about the depth at all. 40 feet was the place where two completely different bets about the future of war were finally settled. Italy had bet on the battleship, the armoured giant safe inside its fortress harbour. Britain had bet quietly and not entirely on purpose on the aeroplane. And on the night of the 11th of November, the bet was called in. Before we go on, one small request, because this next part of these stories belongs to you and not to me. If your father, or your grandfather, or an uncle served in the Fleet Air Arm, or in the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean in those years, I would be honoured if you would put their name and their ship or their squadron in the comments below. The records hold the numbers. The comments are where the names survive. These films are only really doing their job if the people inside them are remembered, and you are the ones who can do that. Part 4. While Williamson's men were being pulled from the water, a second wave was already on its way. 9 more Swordfish, launched about an hour behind the first, led this time by a lieutenant commander named John Hale of 819 Squadron. One of the 9 turned back when its extra fuel tank tore loose in the air. The rest pressed on toward a harbour that was now fully awake, lit by fire and laced with anti-aircraft shells, and they attacked it in exactly the way the first wave had. Low, slow, straight in. Hale's aircraft drove a third torpedo into the new battleship Littorio, which had already been hit twice. Another struck the battleship Caio Duilio, tearing a hole near her forward magazines, so that she had to be run aground to stop her from sinking outright. By the time the last biplane turned for the open sea, the work was finished. The whole thing, from the first flare to the final aircraft leaving, had taken a little over an hour. The last of them came back aboard Illustrious a little before 3 in the morning. When the sun came up over Taranto on the 12th of November, this is what it showed. The battleship Conte di Cavour on the bottom of the harbour, only her upper works standing above the water. The battleship Caio Duilio beached to save her. The battleship Littorio down by the bows and out of the war for months. 3 of Italy's 6 battleships, half of the capital fleet of a great naval power, sunk or disabled in a single night. And the cost to the British had been 2 aircraft. Read that line again. 3 of 6 battleships, 2 aircraft. 2 aircraft did not come back. Of the 4 men who flew them, 2 were pulled from the water and taken prisoner, and 2 were killed. Their names were Lieutenant Gerald Bailey and Lieutenant Harold Slaughter. It is a very small number set against what was achieved that night, and it is right to say it plainly and to let it stand. Now, the Italians had not been wrong about everything. They had been right that the harbour was shallow. They had been right that a torpedo dropped from an aircraft normally dives deep. They had been right that their defences were strong, and in fact their gunners brought 2 of the attackers down out of the dark. What they had been wrong about was one single thing. But it was the thing that mattered. They had assumed the shallow water solved the problem for them. They never once imagined that the enemy had already solved it first. It should be said that luck, that night, ran against them too. Bad weather in the days before had thinned their balloon barrage. Of 90 balloons that should have been flying, only 27 were up, and of the roughly 12,800 metres of torpedo netting the defence of the anchorage called for, barely 4,200 had actually been rigged. The fortress was not quite the fortress on the night it was tested, but make no mistake, even at full strength, none of it would have stopped a torpedo that could run in 40 feet of water. The reaction was disbelief, and then something colder. The official Italian communiqué issued the next day admitted only that a single warship had been seriously damaged, and claimed that 6 of the attacking aircraft had been shot down, when the true figure was 2. But in private, the senior men understood exactly what had happened. Italy's foreign minister, Count Ciano, opened his diary entry for that day with 3 words, "a black day," and the fleet itself did not stay to argue. Within a day, the surviving heavy ships were pulled out of Taranto altogether and moved to Naples, on the far side of the country, away from the British. The great fortress harbour had been abandoned as unsafe, which is perhaps the most eloquent admission of all. In London, Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and told the members that the raid had decisively altered the naval balance in the whole Mediterranean. The admiral who had sent the aircraft, Andrew Cunningham, wrote later in his memoirs that, in a matter of a few flying hours, a score of obsolete biplanes had done more damage to a battle fleet than had been inflicted in the great daylight gun battle of the previous World War, and he judged the fleet air arm to be the most devastating weapon the Navy possessed. Cunningham was not a man given to overstatement. On this, he was not overstating. Williamson and Hale were both later awarded the Distinguished Service Order, gazetted just before Christmas, on the 20th of December 1940. But an honest history has to say the rest of it too. Taranto was a stunning tactical victory. It was not quite the knockout blow it appeared to be. The damaged ships that could be repaired were repaired within months. Cunningham had assumed the shock would keep the Italian fleet cowering in port, and within 5 days the Italians were back out at sea, offering battle off Cape Spartivento. And measured against the thing the British most wanted, cutting the flow of supplies across to the Axis armies in North Africa, Taranto changed remarkably little. The convoys kept running. A crippled fleet is not a destroyed one. And yet something had shifted, and the people who understood that best were not in Rome, and they were not in London. They were in Tokyo. Among the foreign officers who came to study the wreckage was a Japanese naval man, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito. He examined closely what the Swordfish had done, and he would later brief the airmen who led another far larger attack on another anchored fleet in shallow water on a quiet Sunday morning almost exactly a year later. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where these stories usually reach too far. It would be wrong to say that Taranto caused Pearl Harbor. Japan's planners, Yamamoto among them, were already thinking hard about a strike on the American fleet before the Swordfish ever left the deck, and they had been developing their own shallow water torpedoes for years. Taranto did not hand them the idea. What Taranto handed them was something quieter and more dangerous than an idea. Proof. It proved that the thing every navy in the world called impossible had just been done. Done by antiquated aircraft. Done against a fleet that felt completely safe in its own home harbour. The old rule was dead, and now everyone serious knew it was dead, and some of them went home and got to work. Part 5. So let us go back to the mole at Taranto, and to the question we began with. Why did the Italian fleet never believe that 21 obsolete biplanes could do this to them in a single night? Because the arithmetic was sound. That is the answer, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Italians were not stupid, and they were not cowards. They had done the mathematics of their own safety carefully and correctly, and the mathematics told them that 40 feet of water was a wall no torpedo could ever climb. Their reasoning was not insane. It was simply out of date by a matter of months, and nobody had told them. Here is the whole night in 2 sentences. The Italians looked at 40 feet of shallow water and they saw a fortress. The British looked at the same 40 feet of shallow water and they saw a problem to be solved. And then they went and solved it. Same harbour, same depth, same number. 2 completely different bets about what war had quietly become, and only one of them was still true by the morning. We should not turn this into a simple story of British genius and Italian folly, because that is not what it was. The British got lucky with the weather that thinned the balloons. Their great blow did not win the Mediterranean War on its own, and they knew it perfectly well at the time. Brave men flew, and some of them did not come back, for a result that history has probably ranked higher than the men who planned it ever dared to expect. Honesty is part of the reverence. But when all of that is said, and it should be said, the thing still stands. On the night of the 11th of November, 1940, a small number of men flew a small number of outdated aircraft into the most dangerous harbour in Europe, and in a little over an hour they closed an age that had ruled the sea for 400 years. And most of the world did not notice for another year. Remember the names, because the numbers will not do it for you. Kenneth Williamson and his observer, who drove a torpedo into a battleship and then went down into the harbour and into captivity. John Hale, who led the second wave into a harbour that was fully awake and waiting. Gerald Bailey and Harold Slaughter, who did not come home at all. And on the other side of it, the 59 Italian sailors who died that night at their posts, defending a fleet they had every good reason to believe was untouchable. They were not lesser men for having stood on the losing side. They were beaten by an idea, not by any failure of their own worth. There is one more piece of honesty that I owe you. The gunnery officer on the Mole, Antonio Vaccari, the man we began with, is not a single real person. He is a composite, a stand-in, built to carry the point of view of the many real Italian officers who stood in that harbour that night and watched something unfold that their entire training had told them was impossible. I have put no words into a real man's mouth, but the certainty I gave him, and the shock that came after it, were real, and they were shared by a whole navy. If you want the next of these, subscribe, because there are more of them coming. More harbours, more impossible sums that turned out to be wrong, more men on both sides, whose names deserve a great deal better than to quietly disappear. This channel exists to hold on to them for a little while longer. The arithmetic was sound. It was also from a war that had already ended, and nobody had told the men who trusted it. That, in the end, is the whole story of Taranto, and it is the story of the battleship itself, which sat there in its harbour, armoured and enormous and utterly certain, right up until the night a flying antique proved it was already a memory.